Before we break for lunch, we have about 20 minutes for questions. There are a couple of roving microphones in the room. One is back there, one is up here. So if you want to just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and please feel free also to ask questions to the presenters in the first session this morning. I'm sure someone is itching to ask a question. There we go.
I'll get the ball rolling. I just wanted to ask the gentleman from the AIDS Action Europe if he could just tell us a bit more about his point about decriminalisation and HIV and AIDS, because at the moment that's within the National Drug Strategy, and the government are going to start looking at that. So if he could just give us some more information on his thoughts on that, please.
Okay, it's again a huge topic. What we know is that criminalization of activities and also criminalization of key populations stop people from accessing information, testing, treatment, and care. That's bad practice. So when it comes, for instance, to the issue of drug use, some of the countries in Europe that are doing much better providing harm reduction services for drug users, they are not criminalizing, or at least depenalized, personal drug use and possession. So, for instance, in Portugal or in certain parts of Germany, if you're walking around with a certain amount of cannabis, you will not be prosecuted or charged criminal cases. And also when it comes to other drug use, they are not looking at the criminal offense part of it, but they're looking at the helping part, helping to make sure that you use the drug safely, or if you want to come off the drug, or if you want to stop using it, they also help you with that. And that has been seen in the epidemics among drug users, that has dropped and disappeared. I had a chance to visit Geneva harm reduction service. In the middle of the city. There is a safe injecting site, and they reported that there are 0 new infections among drug users in Geneva, just because services are there, and services are much easier to be there when you don't have policies and regulations that block it. I don't know, did that answer your question, or kind of? Okay.
So, microphone.
Just the UNDP were involved in a project called the Global Commission on HIV and the Law about 5 years ago. I was in the UK delegation, and there's a whole range of recommendations and outcomes from that. Maybe worth having a look. Also, the harm reduction strategy for the UK might be worth referencing as part of your find.
Yes, it just came to my mind that a couple of weeks ago we organized the first European HIV Legal Academy, and we were looking at criminalization, and we were also looking at the barriers that block access. And we are working with the HIV Justice Network, whose main aim is to stop criminalization of HIV exposure and thought transmission. And it is very important how we talk about things. The language is important. So when we are talking about HIV transmission, we tend to talk about little, middle, and high risk, or 0, little, and high risk. We have to understand that even sexually with a high viral load, to transmit HIV is a low risk. And then there is negligible risk, and there is 0 risk. So if you look at just from the possibility of passing on HIV, if you look at the criminal law that is addressing this issue, is just very far from being fair. So it's little chance, negligible, and 0 chance to transmit HIV. And still many countries criminalize exposure to HIV or non-disclosure. That is very bad practice. That has to be stopped.
I have a question over here. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Foreman. I thought this morning you mentioned that when they made HIV a notifiable disease, you felt it was associated with the rise in new infections declared. I'd just like a little bit more understanding of how you're making that association.
Yeah. No, I think one of the main arguments that the Department of Health made for it, making it notifiable was to improve on surveillance, because not all doctors around the country who had a positive test in their surgery were obliged legally to report it. A lot of people, social workers, HIV counsellors, voluntary organisations on the ground were against the concept of making it a notifiable disease. And we did a document on this, which I'm sure Susan has in the archive. And World Health, UNAIDS also thought it was counterproductive. And in some countries where it is a notifiable disease, the state then follows through with contacting partners and sexual contacts. And I think that was the fear, that if it was a notifiable disease, people would be afraid to test for fear other people were going to find out their status. But in Ireland, it was very much introduced for surveillance purposes, so even though we were against the concept of it, in practice, the diagnosing doctor or clinic is left with the person who's testing positive in control of how people are informed. Do you know what I mean? There isn't like an external body coming in because it's notifiable, like syphilis and contact tracing partners. That's done in the context of support within the clinic. So I don't think it's affected. That alone has affected the number of people coming forward to test. But I think the fact that and they changed the case reporting for surveillance. I'm not sure exactly how it was done. Somebody might have more information on that in 2015. And I know Niall was saying that he thought that was responsible as well. For it's like we're finding out more about what's there already, if you know what I mean. Is that okay? While I have the microphone, and following on from Mary thing, I just thought that Tony's request that we work towards building an AIDS memorial was a really good one. And I mean, I think there's a lot more information out there. Culturally, there is more beginning to happen. It's like the new generation, I think, are beginning to look back. I know there's a play on during the Dublin Theatre Festival with HIV positive people talking about disclosure and HIV awareness. It opens next week, I think, if I remember rightly. And there are documentaries out there. There was one made in 1990 by the IFPA called Stories from the Silence. And people with the virus, people dying of the virus, talked to camera. That went out on Irish television. So there's a lot of material there that we could draw on to inspire an AIDS memorial. So I'd hope from this conference there might be energy for making that happen, which isn't answering your question, but...
Thanks. Do we have any up here?
So I guess this is a question maybe for Frank, or it's sort of responding to something that you brought up, which is you talked about both the development of this kind of partnership model with civil society working with government, but you're also calling for civil society to be critical and demand more of government. So I'm wondering when NGOs are dependent through this kind of partnership on funding from states, how do they navigate that ability to be critical and strong advocates while also being dependent financially on states? In 30 seconds, please.
Yes, I think I don't have the magic beans to answer your question. I think that is an issue when government or any kind of funding comes with strings attached. So if you cannot express your opinion about a policy in the state, then what is going to happen? Who's going to express that? Of course, we always like to think that as long as your funding is more diversified, you are more free to move around. But then probably you have to fit into different funders' interests and different funders what they need. Our network is funded by the European Commission. I think I was still a bit critical about their role these days when it comes to, and yeah, maybe we won't get the funding next year, who knows? But I think the biggest problem is that generally there is a very shrinking space for civil society funding, and especially community groups. And it's just unbelievable why decision makers and policy makers do not accept the important role that these grassroots organizations are playing. I don't know. It's difficult. But I think, you know, if it's because of your funding, you always have to put it on a scale, whether it's worth saying it publicly or try to do it maybe in another way. You know.
Could I actually just say something on that, Andrew? Because the other side of that is that there's, and you're right. I mean, sometimes NGOs are kind of either restricted from what they can say, or certainly have to be slightly wary, and it is funding related at times. But the benefit of and this comes back to something Ferenc had raised under the Dublin Declaration around collaboration and working together, is that if we sit down with the state, but also NGOs and community groups, ACT UP Dublin, etc., and we know our strengths. You know, we know the strengths of an NGO versus the strengths of ACT UP Dublin. You guys can sometimes say things that we'd love to say, but we can't say, and we can open doors that sometimes you may not be able to open. And by working like that, you know, that's the way we do it. And I suspect, even looking at Maeve's presentation this morning, over the last 30 years, I think that's probably the way that it's happened in Ireland over the last 30 years. So, yeah, there are certain restrictions, but we get around it. So, thank you.
Great. We have time for another question or two. All right, well then I think we can break for lunch. And I want to just thank all the presenters first. It's been a wonderful morning, and I'm looking forward to the afternoon. Thanks.